Hello, friends. I'm Reverend Jeff Prothro, Senior Pastor at Asbury United Methodist Church, a Reconciling Ministries Network church located in Prairie Village, Kansas. As many of you know, for well over 50 years now, the United Methodist Church has been engaged in a very dynamic conversation, or frankly struggle, regarding our understanding of God's inclusive love for all people. Specifically and repeatedly, the church has fallen short of opening the doors wide for the LGBTQIA+ community who strive to participate in the full life of the church. As followers of Christ, members and leaders of local churches, or as ones who've been called to ministry as ordained persons. All have experienced God's call in their hearts, but the United Methodist Church has reached an impasse that is frankly untenable. Much of this impasse is related to what I believe is a misunderstanding of Scripture and a lack of engagement with science. For the past few years, Reverend Lee Johnson and Dr. Barbara Lukert have been working on an article titled Science, Scripture, and Sexuality, the U.S. United Methodist Church at a Crossroads. Now, this article is going to be published in the Journal of Religion and Health that has sought to offer a deeper insight into how we understand Scripture and how we can be faithfully engaged in a current scientific understanding that provides a better framework for seeing the LGBTQIA+ community as part of our diverse human family, created to be in community by God. In the video that follows, Reverend Johnson and Dr. Lukert offer their perspective on this wonderful article they've spent the past few years reworking and editing, why they felt the need to further the conversation, and how it can be utilized in any church setting for study and discussion, not just the United Methodist Church. I am very appreciative of their work, of their understanding of all being created in the image of God. And it is my hope that we can move forward together in welcoming all people into church, celebrating the gifts they bring, and building a beloved community that is reflective of Christ's love for everyone. Enjoy.
So we want to thank Asbury United Methodist Church for hosting us and hosting this YouTube presentation on, we're calling it Science, Scripture, and Sexuality, and the United States United Methodist Church at a Crossroads. And I'm Lee Johnson, and you are?
Barbara Lukert.
Barbara Lukert, and we are sitting here at Asbury, and you have been a member at Asbury for how long,
Since
Barbara?
1992.
Since 1992, and outside of the walls of Asbury, what have you done in life?
Okay. I was an endocrinologist at the University of Kansas Medical Center.
So that gives Barbara the science background, doesn't it?
Yes,
It does.
That's right.
It does. And you've written a few articles.
Yes.
Just a few. Yeah. And my background is I've been a pastor in the United Methodist Church for a number of years, now retired, and I actually retired from Asbury Church, and that's how Barbara and I really got to know each other, was here at Asbury. And so how long have we been working, I'm trying to think, how long have we been working on this presentation and really the article that we've written?
About 100 years.
It feels like 100 years.
I think we've actually been working the article for about 4 years. Before that, we put together the presentation that we did at a couple of churches.
Oh, that's right.
On the same subject.
That's right.
Science and Scripture. And
That's right.
sexuality.
Before the general conference in 2019, we put together a presentation that we took around to several churches in the
Right.
Great Plains Annual Conference, in a way. And so this article was written, and we worked on it really as a response to the 2019 special general conference that was in St. Louis.
Right.
Yeah. And I went to that general conference and sat and I listened to the rhetoric. And I don't know what other word to use other than rhetoric. Yeah, the discussion that occurred on the annual conference floor. And I found myself, it was interesting, it was in a kind of a stadium dome. And I found myself sitting there listening to the discussion, and I kept moving higher and higher and higher in that dome as though I wanted to get away from it. Because what I experienced was, and what I've experienced, we've been doing this now for 50 years in our United Methodist Church. And let me add, really, this is for, not just for United Methodists, but this is for anybody, anywhere who has ever tried to piece together human sexuality and Scripture and the nature of God.
Right, this is just the same thing is happening in society.
Yeah.
In general, and Methodist Church has kind of come to a head.
And so we're kind of the prototype.
But look at what legislation is being passed
Right.
this year, and still remains a huge misunderstanding of sexuality.
And so as I listened to that rhetoric on the general conference floor, it occurred to me that we're almost addicted to the words that we talk because we keep saying the same words over and over and over again. And we can't move on, and we find ourselves just kind of mirrored in this conversation. And so I said, why don't you and I work together to try to change the conversation? Because maybe that's what needs to happen. And why don't we work together, because she's a smart one in all sorts of ways, and why don't we work together to include science? What a novel idea. To include what science reveals about human sexuality, and to include that in our conversation about theology and Scripture and God. Nobody wakes up in the morning and chooses her sexuality. And we're having this conversation as though people self-select on a daily basis their sexuality, and science certainly reveals otherwise. And so we're trying to piece together what our article does is it kind of traces the history of the United Methodist Church, really going all the way back to the Methodist Church in 1967 when the Good News Movement was founded. And they were founded out of a desire to create a more orthodox understanding of Wesleyan theology. And so we're trying to piece together, let's include science in our discussion. I think there is room in who we are and our tradition as Methodists to include the discoveries of science. So what are some things that we've worked on that people should include in the discussion?
Well, I think it's become obvious to a lot of people that work in the area of behavioral science that homosexuality just is. I mean, it's not like people decide they're going to be homosexual. It's like Marcus Borg said. Somebody asked him, "Do you believe in God?" And he said, "Well, that's like asking me, do I believe in elephants?" He said, "They just are."
Yeah, God just is.
They're part of nature. They're part of nature. And so over the years, observing patients and friends and acquaintances, family members, it became obvious to me that this is a lifelong pattern. Homosexuality doesn't just begin when people pass puberty and become sexually active. It's determined before birth even. And the information that's been gained by scientists since the early 1990s has certainly proved that homosexuality is determined by hormonal and genetic and immunologic factors even before birth, during fetal exposure to hormones within the mother's uterus. So that this is predetermined. There's an area at the very base of the brain, I like to point up to the roof of my mouth, or just above that. There's an
Up there?
Up
Yeah,
there.
yeah.
There's an area there that is called the supranuclear nucleus, and it it's a very important structure in determining sexual orientation. And it's been shown in animals, in humans, and all kinds of experiments that the exposure of that area of the brain during the development of the brain to hormones determines whether the person will have same-sex or opposite-sex attraction. And, you know, it's been shown in 1,500 different animal species. There are herds of sheep, you know, in northwestern United States that 10% of them are homosexual, even if they are given a choice between male and female mates. So it's a natural phenomenon that people are born with, and they have to decide how they're going to live this out. And when churches and all kinds of religious organizations say that this is incompatible with Christian teachings, they cause terrible problems, problems much beyond the sexuality. You know, the incidence of eating disorders and severe depression and suicide is so much higher in people with same-sex orientation.
And the article kind of reflects upon that, doesn't it?
It really does, yes.
Yeah.
It does.
So we've had this discussion in the United Methodist tradition about human sexuality without science.
Yes.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
attempted, back in 1992, we attempted to have this discussion with science, and the article reflects upon that, and all of a sudden, you know, we couldn't have the discussion. And
it's still difficult to get the hierarchy of the church to include science in the discussion.
so let me ask you, as somebody a person of faith and somebody who is deeply rooted in scientific study and research, how do you put together God and science?
Well, I think that science is just trying to understand God and trying to understand God's creation. And there's no conflict. You know, I've actually heard some scientists say they make an observation that they didn't expect. And I've heard them say, now why would God have done that? You know, why would it be that way? So I've never really understood this conflict between science and religion. Yeah. It should be, you know, hand in glove.
And we talk about what has authority in our church and in the United Methodist tradition. We talk about authority, and you know that the authority of Scripture. And so when it comes to the authority of Scripture, there were like 7 verses in Scripture or so. And the article reflects upon that people love to cite when it comes to homosexuality, and that these 7 verses take precedence over what science reveals.
Yeah.
How do you say a little bit about that?
Well, I think, you know, we forget that scientific understanding has to inform what we believe about Scripture, because in the days that Scripture was written, none of this was known, you know. And people were always struggling to try to understand why things were happening. And then as science developed, there were more and more tools to help us understand why certain conditions exist.
So it was though the world couldn't be round, could it?
No.
Because Scripture tells us the world
is flat.
is flat. Yeah. And so it took a while for theologians to go, well, maybe, who was that, Galileo? Or,
yes.
Yeah, that maybe he had a point to prove.
Yes, they had a terrible time with him, didn't they?
Yeah, they really did. They did. So there's always been that kind of source of tension between science and Scripture and the nature of God. And what we're trying to say is, I think they complement each other quite well.
I think so too. Yeah. And I think in the paper, when they read the description of a couple of patients that we presented, really helps you understand the complexity of sexuality and how people struggle with it.
Yeah. Well, our United Methodist Church right now is in the midst of what do we call it, a schism.
Right.
And some churches are voting to leave the United Methodist tradition and go an independent way, or to go the global Methodist church way. And at the bottom line of this discussion is human sexuality.
Right. And that's what is really sad, I think, is that people who are voting on whether to stay or leave, most of them haven't had the opportunity to know the science behind development of sexual orientation. So they really don't understand. And they haven't been given information. It's not in the public press. In fact, one of the things that really made me aware that we really need to get this out to people was that in about 2011, there was a review of hormonal influence on sexuality in the Journal of Clinical Endocrinology and Metabolism. It was a wonderful summary of all of these factors that determine whether a person will be attracted to the same or the opposite sex. But that's not, most people don't have
That available.
they don't have that available, and it certainly isn't seen in the lay press, the non-medical press.
And they haven't heard a conversation or a reflection upon how does God have a hand in science?
No, the connection.
The connection between God and science, and what science reveals the presence of God.
Right.
And we hope that this article might help people do that. I'm not a fan. I'm not a fan of schism.
Yeah.
It makes me sad to see what's happening in our Methodist tradition right now over something that I think need not happen. It need not happen. And the first, when you learn about Methodist tradition and history, and you study schisms, and you're going to learn about the schism in 1844. And the schism in 1844 in the United States was over slavery and an understanding of slavery. And is it biblical? And so the church split. The church split right down the middle. And you had the Methodist Episcopal Church North and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And do you know how many years it took them to lay aside the conversation that they were having and have a new conversation? In 1844, it wasn't until 1939 that the Methodist Church laid that aside and reunited. And you know where they reunited? Just down the street. Well, a couple miles away, but down here in Kansas City is where they had the unification conference. I would like to think that it's not going to take 100 years.
I hope not.
I would like to think that it's not going to take 100 years and to lay aside what we think we all know, and we hope that this article and this research that we've done can be a start.
Yes.
So
Definitely.
God bless you all for listening to us, and we hope that you'll link your way to this article and read it, and we hope that it does what we intend.